Okay, good evening everyone. I am Ritam Datto, and you all are watching Victorian Vanguard. So, today we have Liana Jondy from Queen's University. Shauli, would you like to introduce her?
Everyone, I'm Shauli and you are watching Victorian Vanguard. So today we have with us Liana Jondy. Liana is a PhD candidate at Queen's University in Kingston. Her dissertation developed as a result of her interest in Victorian animal studies and namely studies related to animals in the outside of the Victorian home and the ideological shifts occurring within the 19th century with regards to animal rights and well-being. While her dissertation looks towards a variety of literary genre within the Victorian period to consider how working animals were represented in relation to humans, she is also interested in video game studies through an eco-critical lens, horror studies, and bug studies, which is the topic of today's lecture. So the title of today's lecture is Some Ugly Things Are Very Useful to Us, Sentimentalism and Anthropomorphism in 19th century bug autobiographies and educational children's literature. It will be focusing on primarily on how Edith Carrington uses the perspective of a fly in the story of Fly to problematize human animal relationship, and also it challenges the perspective like perceived differences between humanity and insects. So we are very glad to have Liana with us today. So Liana, would you like to say something? And you can directly jump onto your talk as well.
Sure. I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to be here today to listen to me talk about bugs. And honestly, my talk today was created because of a lot of my interest in non-human animals and, you know, like how Shali said, um, how they were represented back then, primarily in literature, and the kinds of things that are happening to them in a more contemporary sense with like movies and other types of media. So yeah, I'm very excited to be able to talk to you all about bugs in specifically within Edith Carrington's work on children's literature and the stuff she was publishing, because that's actually a little bit of what my dissertation is focused on. Like, I have an entire chapter dedicated to her because there's not very many people out there writing about her, and I think that needs to be said. So I hope at least one of the goals of my talk today is that some of you will go out there and look up her stuff and want to read it and write about it, because I'd be super excited to get to hear what you all think about her work. Yeah, okay. I'm gonna try and share my screen and uh, hopefully it will work.
Yeah, we can see your screen. Perfect.
Okay. Um, is it like in the present mode, or is it just like
I think
showing
you need
you
to
the
click
slide?
on. Yeah, we can only see the slides. So I think you need to press on the slideshow option that you can see there.
Okay. Yeah. Is it showing it now? Just as the first slide?
Yeah, we can see the first slide only.
Okay, awesome. Okay, unfortunately I can't see all of you, so just interrupt if something is going on with
Yeah,
the slides and
definitely.
stuff.
If anything goes wrong, we'll like ask you. You don't worry. You just go on with your presentation.
Okay. Right. So, like I said, thank you all for taking the time to be here today. The title of my presentation is Some Ugly Things Are Very Useful to Us, Sentimentalism and Anthropomorphism in 19th-Century Bug Autobiographies and Educational Children's Literature. Um, so I think that this quote from John F.M. Clarke's Bugs and the Victorians is something that, perfectly sums up the aim of my talk today. And that's the way that anthropomorphism, metaphor, analogy, and allegory have sustained themselves as ways of making sense of the world in which we live in. So despite focusing mostly on how bugs are represented in instructional literature for children, I thought it would be an interesting way to, start my presentation by tying in some perspectives on how bugs have been represented as monsters, or how bugs are represented in nature, or as being in nature through naturalism. So yeah, I wanted to begin with some really brief discussion on how bugs have been represented as monsters and the implications behind those representations. So April Joy Jovita wrote, these chitinous creatures have served as vehicles for exploring everything from nuclear anxiety to environmental collapse, from body horror to psychological disintegration. In other words, bugs have been understood and conceptualized for being anything but themselves. So bugs are not only bugs, they're not only insects, but they serve to represent our own human-centered fears, ideals, and our own human-centered knowledge. And, what better ways have bugs been featured as anything but themselves than in the following examples? And some of these might be familiar to you. So when I think about how bugs have been featured in literature or media, I think about how they've been represented as the embodiment of our ultimate fears. Our fear of losing our sense of humanity, or our fear of the non-human animal challenging our ways of living and our ways of knowing, so our knowledge. And, in campy monster movies, and the, 1950s atomic age movies, the fear of nuclear fallout and the subsequent, permanent or temporary alteration of the natural world is the focal point of the narratives they fashion. So you have like fear of large insects, that's the primary kind of narrative they're fashioning. I think Cronenberg's The Fly is a great example of just one way in which our fear of the non-human animals, of bugs, is manifested or explored through slippages regarding what makes us human and what makes animals not human. Right? So in the movie, the way in which the collapse of the human self and human body occurs slowly builds up the sense of tension and terror, right? Because you have Seth, the main character, beginning to transform, but what's more interesting about his transformation is the way that he slowly begins to lose himself to the animal. And interestingly, what transforms last, so what signals his ultimate transformation into a monstrous fly, is the loss of his human eyes. And, I take that to be like the loss of his human perspective and, his ability to make sense of the world through being in the world as a human being. Okay. One other important feature of my talk today is the way in which bugs have been understood as being in nature, or something to understand and classify and, more importantly, collect, right? So in Bugs and the Victorians, I'm going to bring up Clarke again because his book is very important to my talk. Clarke claims that, to quote, natural history had long sought to locate animals in human culture. Early Renaissance natural history included exhaustive explorations of myths and folk tales attached to particular animals. An animal's symbolic currency in human culture was an acknowledged element of its natural history. So, in other words, the animal is always a symbol. Even in our endeavors to understand them and ourselves, they are always represented as something other than themselves. Natural history is inextricable from symbolisms, or symbolism. The animal, in other words, the real animal, is not the same as the symbolic animal. The symbolic animal is an animal emptied of its individual qualities and represented in terms of its most ideal self, a self that I just mean satisfies our expectations. So ideal doesn't necessarily have to be good. It just has to satisfy our expectations. In the 18th and 19th century, it became increasingly popular to collect specimens, one such specimen being bugs. And I'll quote Clark here again, who talks about how, to quote, interest in entomology grew as people increasingly engaged in insect collecting. Economic and social changes laid behind the burgeoning interest in natural history. The accumulation of personal wealth and the related acquisition of things accompanied the rise of consumer capitalism in 18th century England. The publication of books on natural history was indicative of the commercialization of leisure and increasing literacy in Enlightenment England. I think another important feature of publications on natural history and the types of collections that, Clark refers to is the way in which these types of collections entail cataloging insects and observing their bodies.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I think your PPT is not working. I think what is needful is that you need to go through the particular slides and then, yeah, now it's working.
Okay, I'll just leave it like this then.
Yeah, it definitely works.
Okay, I'll just leave it like this. Okay, so this is the quote I'm referring to here about how interest in entomology grew. So I'll just summarize again. Cataloging insects for human consumption, but when I say consumption, I don't mean literal consumption. I just mean, metaphorical consumption. So the ways in which non-humans are represented as commodities and commercialized for us. And now we're going to get into the main aspect of my talk today about bugs in instructional children's literature. And I think what ties basically the previous two sections to this section is the fact that there's an element of the desire or preoccupation to observe the non-human in instructional children's literature. So in 1894, a reviewer who commented on Edith Carrington's chapter, How to Observe Without Destroying, writes, to quote, "It is quite possible, according to Miss Carrington's experience, to make friends, or at least to be on terms of acquaintance with so irritable a creature as a wasp." The reviewer's comment on Carrington's text emphasizes the pejorative connotations of our perceived distance from bugs and how our tendency to anthropomorphize the non-human animal extends to insects. So, attributing human qualities and expressions to non-human animals meant that humans and animals could become friends. So, in other words, the irritable wasp, keenly seen as a pest animal, when represented in Carrington's work, becomes a non-human animal to study and conceptualize in relation to human life. In Carrington's The Story of a Fly, The representation of a singular bug as the titular object of fascination is framed by the young protagonist's ignorance of the nature of bugs and the subsequent lessons that she learns from the adult figures around her about the fly's role in the natural world. And interestingly enough, how the fly is important to the home itself. In Carrington's efforts to convey the fly's role in nature, however, the fly directs the focus of the narrative, leading to expressions that would inevitably anthropomorphize the fly. So, in this section, I mainly want to explore how Carrington's The Story of a Fly sentimentalizes and anthropomorphizes the fly as a non-human animal and a narrative subject in order to problematize human-animal relationships. In other words, challenge the perceived differences between humans and insects. And I'm going to bring up Clark here again. But just to quote, whether for the purposes of legitimation or self-definition, humans often projected their own social and cultural arrangements onto their interpretations of nature. So ultimately, I'm going to consider how the subjectivity of the fly through the use of a first-person narrative in Carrington's story is meant to bridge the distance between the unrecognizable other and the human to aid in promoting lessons on kindness and consideration in young children. In other words, Carrington's The Story of a Fly takes up the imagined perspective of a pest creature and transforms the pest into an archetype for sentimentalism. So, just to get a little bit into sentimentalism, sentimentalism originated in the 19th century as an antithesis to rationalism. Sentimentalism emphasized the importance of being self-governed by emotion as opposed to reason. So in the context of animal literature, I'm just going to quote here from Archer, Leon, and Hawkes, sentimentalism is a part of fiction's power to mediate cross-species commonalities and human grieving for non-human suffering. However, in response to sentimentalists' concern for non-human suffering, there was a lot of widespread criticism directed towards sentimentalists for their disregard for the variety of ways in which non-human animals are mistreated and harmed. So, I have it quoted on the bottom there, but in the October 9, 1904 edition of Vogue, for example, there was a section of the issue that includes a critique of sentimentalists who, I'm going to quote here, shrieked against hunting and submitting a rabbit to vivisection in order to discover the seat of a disease, or even to put a cat under the same treatment, and yet allow cats to starve in the summer when they leave their townhouses and to become almost as wild beasts and terrible nuisances. So an important aspect of Carrington's representation of animals in children's literature is the way in which she engages with sentimentalism and anthropomorphism to humanize non-human animals, allowing them to direct the perspective of the narratives she creates. So indeed, in The Story of a Fly, Carrington utilizes anthropomorphism to situate the little housefly as the main protagonist of the narrative, and as Jane Spencer astutely notes in relation to children's literature in general with animal characters, to quote, further middle-class hegemony through spreading domestic ideology and values such as obedience, kindness to animals, and appreciation of the natural world. The subject of Carrington's narrative allows for the young protagonist, Rose, who is the young character of the novel to develop an appreciation for the natural world, as she must learn to navigate the domestic sphere and contend with the importance of the fly's presence in the natural world. Um, However, Rose lacks access to the inner subjectivity of the fly, while interestingly, readers do not. So, as such, readers necessarily usurp the position of the imagined fly while maintaining their own anthropomorphic ideals. So, in other words, the narrative, despite being told from the perspective of a little fly, utilizes anthropomorphism to assure readers that their own way of being and knowing is sustained. And the little fly essentially poses no threat to them. So, in order to consider how Carrington's short story functions within animal autobiographical narratives, I think it's important to define the genre, right? In representing animal minds in early animal autobiography, for instance, Julie A. Smith defines animal autobiography as a first-person fictional narrative in which an animal tells its own story. She explains later in the article that animal autobiographies represent and depict, to quote, real animals in order to promote the lessons of kindness. Smith continues that compassion for creatures whose natures were fantastic only of the human imagination would make no sense for the focus of an animal autobiography, since such animals would obviously not be impacted by mistreatment. Furthermore, many authors of animal autobiographies care deeply about real animals and animal welfare. Thus, animal autobiography needed real animal natures, rather, to write about. End quote. So, according to Smith, animal autobiographies relied on fragmented and loosely connected events because, to quote, animals in these works have no long-range goals for self-actualization. So in the article, Smith asked, a kind of important question. What then can be the plot of an animal autobiography? But I think what Smith's consideration of animal autobiography overlooks is the fictionalization of the real animal who is made the subject and thus the focus of the animal autobiography. So, in other words, despite needing real animals to write on, are they truly real in a sense? So while Smith emphasizes the benefits of animal autobiography and the supposed absence of anthropomorphism in those types of narratives, Anastasia Andrianova is critical of the role that anthropomorphism plays in fictionalizing the real non-human animal. And I'll quote her here. The debate about anthropomorphism in animal studies reveals that, paradoxically, by analogizing non-human animals to human experience, animals are at once humanized, with animal difference erased and objectified, transformed into a metaphor and a means to a human end, both risking anthropocentrism. So again, contrary to Smith's claim that animal autobiographical authors relied on real animal natures to write their stories, Andrianova astutely considers how attributing a human voice and human perspective to a non-human animal removes and alienates the real subject, rendering the animal character a caricature of its real-life counterpart. But again, I'm going to switch back to the other side, right, where you have scholars talking about how there are benefits to relying on anthropomorphism to understand our non-human counterparts, right? So, scholars such as Erica Fudge in Animal, which was published in 2002, wrote that, an anthropomorphic gaze is essentially unavoidable. So I'm going to quote her here, but she says that if I cannot say that a dog is sad, what can I say that it is? In a sense, without anthropomorphism, we are unable to comprehend and represent the presence of an animal. In other words, in order to make sense of the world, we rely on anthropomorphism to situate ourselves with and within the beings around us. To use Fudge's example, when we say that, to quote, this dog is sad, we deny the incomprehensible, that which is not known to us. We assign the non-human animal subject human emotions and even human-like behaviors because we aim to actively bridge the divide between them and us at the risk of commodifying and objectifying them. So Carla Armbruster, who's another scholar I'm going to bring up here, remarks that straightforward animal autobiographies like Black Beauty and Beautiful Joe take animal life seriously in a different way. Not so much by striving to represent animal consciousness or behavior accurately, but rather by working to generate compassion for non-human animals and thus improve their treatment. And while, Armbruster does not engage with Carrington's narratives, I think the similarities among case studies are evident. Publishing animal narratives around the same time that Anna Sewell published Black Beauty and Marshall Sanders published Beautiful Joe, Carrington strives to not only represent animal behavior accurately, but also to generate compassion for creatures that are mistreated. But the consequences, however, in Carrington's approach to representing the non-human animal and giving it a voice stems from the risk of misrepresentation and erasure of difference that Armbruster mentioned. By giving the fly a voice, Carrington risks misrepresenting the real animal and objectifying their experiences. However, in her efforts to represent the experience of a fly and endorse compassion and care for creatures that are typically considered pests, Carrington relies on a deliberate level of anthropomorphism to reinforce and embrace the differences between the human protagonists in the narrative. And the human protagonists include the young protagonist Rose, Mr. Sutton, and Miss Sutton, and I can't forget the bug protagonist as well. So in their efforts to represent the lives of non-human animals, Victorian writers, artists, and naturalists alike attempted to grapple with their ever-expanding worldview and fascination with the lives of bugs. And I'll quote Clark here, but he states that by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, insects became attractive subjects precisely because of their apparent distance from humanity. And because of their apparent distance from humanity, bugs could be represented as simultaneously human and non-human in literary works that attempted to assign various insects distinctly human voices and human subjectivities. Both the narrative and the illustrations within Carrington's The Story of a Fly serve to superficially maintain the perceived distance between human characters and insects. So, for instance, while the main protagonist of Carrington's story, A Little Fly, directs the narrative and propels its plot forward with its existence in the literary text, the little fly's presence in the narrative is a way of maintaining anthropomorphically defined classificatory boundaries. So the fly, in other words, reinforces anthropocentric boundaries because the narrative uses the little fly as an instrument, as an instructional vehicle for teaching the young human protagonist, Rose, the value and the lives of even the smallest of living beings. So in Carrington's text, I think the fly becomes more than just an embodiment of human interests and human ideals. I think the fly is an individual subject that embodies its own otherness in relation to the human characters around it. So in order to teach care and compassion to young readers, Carrington relies on anthropomorphizing the fly. In this regard, the materiality of animals and the relationships with humans in Carrington's text is mediated by the didactic expression of care and compassion. So just to go into the story itself, time and time again, the little fly is made overtly aware of the fragility of its physical composition and the responsibility directed towards humans to be aware that, to quote, "We tiny flies are made so lightly and we are so small. A mere touch will crush our dainty wings or break our slender legs or hurt our eyes," end quote. And what I want to call attention to in this passage here is the little fly's use of adjectives like, tiny, lightly, small, dainty, and slender to describe the physical composition of flies, beyond repeating synonymic words, is indicative of the narrative's attempts to fashion an ideal representation of the insect in the reader's mind. Right, a representation that adopts qualities perpetuated in the 19th century with regard to femininity. So tiny, lightly, small, dainty, and slender are adjectives that lead the reader to frame the little fly in contrast to pest animals that are described using terminology that reinforces avoidance and disgust in insects. So by describing the little fly using adjectives that are linked to an idealized form of femininity and reinforce ideal representations of non-human animals, the narrative can appeal to the young reader's preconceived notions of non-human animals and their responsibility in ensuring that non-human animals are not harmed. In other words, make the bug look interesting, I guess, and not something to be feared. While the reader has access into the inner mind of the little fly throughout the narrative and through the first person perspective, Rose, the young protagonist, does not. As a result, the young protagonist has to navigate her family home with the little fly in her presence and learn the value in the little fly's existence. As Rose learns the value in the smallest of non-humans, the fly becomes an object of instruction and a vehicle for teaching compassion towards non-humans that initially repulse. So, for instance, Rose is not shy of declaring her vehement disgust over the little fly's presence. And I'll quote here, and every instance in which you see, outside of the quotations an I, that is actually the little fly saying I. So, "I feel sure that she did not know me, for she cried out, 'Oh, Granny, here's a nasty fly on my bread and honey. I dare say that the horrid thing has been crawling all over it.' I wish a spider would come and catch it, went on Rose quite crossly. For I do not like to kill it myself. And here she gave me a little poke with a fork, but not hard enough to hurt me. End quote. Unlike the little fly's earlier description of itself, that relied on adjectives that perpetuate ideal representations, Rose declares that the fly is nasty, which is indicative, like I said, of terminology that pertains to theories of evolutionary psychology and parasite avoidance theory of disgust. So, just to go into a little bit of the avoidance theory of disgust, Yuya Fukano and Masashi Soga talk about how urbanization is one of the forces behind parasite avoidance theory of disgust. So I'll quote them here. According to them, urbanization drives fear and disgust in insects in two ways. One being that urbanization increases the sightings of insects indoors, and insects that are seen more often indoors induce stronger feelings of disgust than those seen outdoors. And two, urbanization reduces people's natural history knowledge about insects, and this decreased knowledge results in feelings of disgust towards a broader range of insects. So, Fukano and Soga's hypothesis is applicable to Carrington's text insofar as it pertains to recognizing, the implications behind Rose's initial disgust over the little fly. The fly's assertion that Rose, to quote, did not know him, establishes the deductive rationale behind the narrative. Not only does Rose not know the little fly, she, and perhaps the reader, also builds misleading assumptions about the little fly because of their lack of knowledge on natural history. As such, the little fly, and by extension, essentially the entirety of the narrative, and other adult characters in the narrative, strive to educate Rose on the necessity of the fly's presence within the home. So, for example, I have a moment here in which Mrs. Sutton, Rose's grandmother, and by the way, the only maternal character in the narrative, is critical of Rose's expression of disgust and actively strives to impart important lessons about the little fly using her knowledge of natural history. So I'm going to quote here from the text. I'm glad you did not go on feeling cross with the poor little fly, Rose, said Miss Sutton. We should miss them much if we had none, for they help to keep our houses sweet and clean. No maid with her broom could get at all the tiny cracks and corners where the flies go. The eyes of no woman in the world could see what the fly can. Do you know that his round ball of eye is made up of many hundreds of bits, and that each bit can see a new way? Unquote. Mrs. Sutton's attempts to educate Rose by referring to how we should miss flies very much if we had none because, they help to keep our houses sweet and clean, is rooted in the ecological fear that the extinction of non-human animal species, so in other words, the absence of a species and the resulting shift in human and non-human dynamics, could threaten established anthropocentric norms and ideals. As a result of her appreciation over the fly's presence in their family home, Mrs. Sutton begins to draw on her knowledge of natural history, relating to Rose in a deductive manner, in other words, through question and response, that the little fly's round ball of eye is made up of many hundreds of bits. So, trying to teach her about the physical composition of a fly, essentially. But even Rose's grandfather, Mr. Sutton, takes it upon himself to correct Rose on her own misconceptions about the little fly. So I'll quote here again from the text. "Look, here's a little housefly," said Rose. "He is standing quite still on a lump of sugar. What is he doing, Granny?" "He is eating it, dear." "Can he bite it up?" "Bite it up? No," said Mr. Sutton, putting down his paper and coming up to us. "The fly has no teeth. He has a trunk. He sends down some juice through his trunk onto the sugar. This juice melts it, and then he sucks it up again." End quote. So Mr. Sutton's interjection is, I think, emblematic of the urgency in which the lack of knowledge is addressed to remedy Rose's fear and disgust in the little fly. Once again, the narrative focuses on the physical composition of the fly and the importance placed on observation to teach young children. And I think that these particular moments, these didactic moments, emphasize a shift in Rose's worldview. However, in addition to the narrative's attempts to address Rose's misconceptions, the narrative also relies on the little fly's first-person perspective to address the reader's lack of knowledge. And I'll quote here, "I slid with care down the sides of the jug, holding firmly on with the little soles of my feet, which I am thankful to say have suckers on them, which make it easy for me to run where I like without falling." End quote. Although the little fly is describing its body and the value it recognizes in its physical composition, its statement about how, to quote, "the little soles of my feet have suckers on them, which make it easy for me to run where I like," end quote, places onus on the reader to take up Rose's positionality in the narrative as an individual that needs to be taught. And I just want to shift towards talking about the illustrations as well in the short story, and I have the illustrations on the slide as well that I'll switch to. But I think they're really interesting in terms of trying to think about what the narrative does and how it takes up the position of the fly, even by using the illustrations. So these illustrations were created by F.M. Cooper, and I think they serve to emphasize the physical distinction between the little fly and the human characters, as well as the apparent insignificance of the little fly's presence within the home. So, I'm going to call attention to this illustration that was titled "Something in a Small Jug." And this illustration visualizes the little fly's insignificance, as the fly is placed in the periphery of the illustration, not the foreground. Instead, the reader's gaze is drawn to the jar of milk and the jar of sugar, implying that the readers themselves have taken up the position of the little fly. So, in other words, we're kind of like drawn into the jar of honey and sugar. In other words, the illustrations attempt to bridge the divide between the fly and human readers, as the readers are encouraged to perceive events through the perspective of the little fly, but also to recognize the little fly's separation and active presence independent from humans. And inability to maintain the focus of the narrative. And while the fly is a catalyst for much of the events in the narrative and the primary instructional tool for Rose, the little fly is simply used to, I'm going to quote here from Millen, help the new individual human reader connect the fixed and fictionalized animal to their own apparent heartfelt response to that animal type. End quote. Essentially, effectively rendering the little fly an archetype for sentimentalism and the limits of human compassion. So, this illustration, it may not be very apparent because of how it is composed, but this illustration is drawn up from a moment in the text in which the fly is drowning in the little cup and the children are watching it drown. Right? So we don't see the fly though, and so thinking about perspective in the text is important as well. Right. Yeah, so I'm gonna shift over to my conclusion, but I'm gonna bring up Armbruster again here. Armbruster highlights the importance of critical engagement with stories that attempt to give the non-human animal a distinctly human voice. I'm going to quote here. It is important that critics interested in literature that gives voice and mind to animals explore what constitutes a responsible approach to the talking animal. End quote. As Armbruster succinctly points out, there is a lack of critical consensus on what constitutes a responsible approach to the talking animal. And I'll bring up Simons here as well, who says that if, as a result of seeing the human experience played out in animal guise, any person has had cause to change his or her behavior towards animals, or his or her conception of what it might be to live as a non-human animal, then such narratives play a useful role in the promotion of a better way in the treatment of animals. End quote. In other words, a responsible approach to representing the non-human animal would entail promoting better treatment and compassion for them. And I think there is no doubt that Carrington's text could very well be considered a text that aims to promote compassion for non-human animals and places a lot of the emphasis on the human to alter their dynamic and their engagement with the natural world. However, we can't forget, though, that the little fly is framed in relation to anthropocentric ideals and human interests to superficially foreground the non-human animal's experience and frame them as though they are anything but human experiences and a human voice. So Carrington's text, in other words, reveals the extent to which a responsible approach to the talking animal relies on fictionalizing and idealizing the non-human animal. And in Carrington's efforts to give the non-human a voice, she certainly risks misrepresenting the non-human animal, but her efforts to perpetuate compassion for all non-humans is not overshadowed despite that. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Liana. It was a
Thank you so much.
wonderful lecture. I mean, you touched upon almost every aspect. In fact, I like the way when you are explaining those illustrations. In fact, you even mentioned the politics of language and so many other factors that were involved. It was a fantastic lecture. Shauli, you were saying something.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your lecture. I mean, since we are talking about animal studies here, and yeah, that is something that I have also noticed. Like the entire anthropomorphism movement has also prioritized the non-human animals, specifically the mammals. So you talking about bug literature, this was also the first thing that came to my mind, that we do not take into consideration the insects and the bugs while we are talking about animal studies. So the shift that you made from mammals to anthropods to insect studies is something that was very enticing. That is the first point. And second point is that if we think about this entire idea of the fly, it's very interesting. We see that literature fly is something that is that is thought to be something so trivial that not a lot of people talk about it. But then you see literature being enmeshed with so many examples of flies. For example, I remember a Jondan poetry, this metaphysical poetry comparing the lovers, the fly, like the mosquito drinking blood from the lovers and comparing the mosquito to the lover's bed. And I think Ritom, I think everyone will find it very funny. There is there is this Bollywood, a very melodramatic movie called Makhi that we grew up watching. It was like someone dying and then they reincarnated as a fly. So that is also something that came to my mind instantly. But yeah, thank you so much. Such a lovely lecture. I think audience also loved the lecture a lot. And now the floor is open for the audience to engage in a conversation with you. Yeah. John Donne's metaphysical poetry. I think the name is Flea.
Yes.
Let's see
Okay, I have
what.
some questions. I
Yeah,
mean, it's not
yeah. You
question,
can
but
go
I just
ahead.
wanted to know your opinion. I mean, this whole idea, na, you mentioned Angenova's point of view that without, I mean, if we are anthropomorphizing the insects, then in a way we are kind of um, highlighting that humans are the superior creature. We are kind of promoting human exceptionalism. However, you also mentioned the fact that Erika Fudge has completely denied this argument because without this, we cannot really portray how animals are feeling. So, what your point of view? Do we need to use anthropomorphism, or do we need to stick to without interfering anything?
That's such a great question because I've given that so much thought as well. I mean, like my supervisor also asked me that question too, like, what's your opinion on anthropomorphism? And I mean, I have to agree with Erica Fudge in terms of the fact that an anthropomorphic engagement with the natural world, you know, it's unavoidable. We see animals to be the smallest of things, and we project human kind of emotions and human aspects to them as a way of making sense of the world around us because we're always doing that, right? With like my head's going crazy with like all the things in terms of the shifting landscape in the 19th century in terms of moving away from the countryside to now like the city, right? And well, now we have to be separate from animals rather than in close quarters with them. But at that time, they were really specific about what kinds of animals they wanted to be near them, right? So that was in reference to mammals, right? They needed food animals around them. They had cats and dogs, but even in a lot of respects, cats and dogs were also seen as pests, right? Something to be disregarded. But then in terms of bugs, right, specifically flies, I read this very interesting um, text, and I think it appears in Clark's book about how there was actually a movement going around that was talking about how flies carry diseases and they fester in those kinds of things and how they have to be killed. Kill the fly in your house. Don't let it stay in your house. So it's like there's just so much. And I have to agree with Erica Fudge. Despite my belief that there are some problems with anthropomorphizing animals because we project the animal beyond itself. Like it doesn't become the real animal anymore. It becomes our version of it. I think it's important, like the way that we do that, and it's important to recognize that we do that.
Exactly. I mean, that's a very well answered response. And also, you mentioned this, na, Yua Fukano has also mentioned that urbanization kind of reduces the knowledge that people had about these insects, and that is why we are not really feeling associated, and we don't even know what are they and how important they are to us. And like Shaoli mentioned, there is this movie called Makhi, which translate as fly, and that also kind of talk and shows us the agency behind fly, if I may say, from that point of view. So that is very interesting.
You know what? You should watch the movie. It will give you a very different and a very humorous experience. That like someone dying and then reincarnation happening as fly, and then they take revenge from their murderer. So it's a very funny movie, but also it talks about the agency of the fly. That how I mean, it's specifically the same idea, like Call of the Wild. You see the world from the perspective of the dog. So just because it's a melodramatic thing, but the idea behind it is very noble. That you look at the world from the perspective of a fly.
Yeah, no, that sounds fascinating because I mean, I feel like you're talking about the melodrama, right, and the kind of
Yeah,
comedy that comes from it. And then you have like the example that I talked about earlier about Cronenberg's The Fly,
right.
where it's like the person becoming a fly is like a monstrous process because it's slow and it's oh, that's okay. I'll have to watch that. I'll have to watch it
Yeah, I
then.
think if I find the movie on YouTube, I'll link it in the chat box for you to watch.
Yeah, I'd love that.
That is great. So, if you have any question that you want to ask, you can ask in the comment section or in the chat box, or you can raise your hand to ask. I can see there is a comment rather by Kia Roy, and she mentioned, I would like to pursue my PhD in children's literature. This was a different, great perspective. I will be looking into it. Thank you for this great lecture, ma'am. And it truly is. I mean, when we look at Victorian literature, and especially when we look at animal studies, we often neglect this aspects, I guess. So this is very interesting. I have another question, which is not really a very high question, but rather the question is like. Would you say that Carrington's work is truly post humanist in spirit, or is it still grounded in a deeply human centered framework that only mimics the decentering? Because you mentioned, I think it kind of blends with it.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I would call her work post-humanist, if I'm being honest. I think a lot of what she tries to do is like at the end of the day, if I'm looking at the goal, her goal is pretty human-centered. Like she's appealing to people and their sensibilities, and a lot of the time their sensibilities are rooted in their own preoccupations with like reinforcing their own worldview, and oftentimes that's a human worldview. Um, so I wouldn't say she was necessarily working within a post-humanist framework, but certainly like trying to use naturalism in a way that again gonna say it like trying not to fictionalize animals, but inevitably because of the genre in which she's working in, right, which is like animal autobiography, um, children's literature specifically, like it's inevitable that she has to fictionalize the animal. There's also another really interesting book where she sort of writes a novel like Black Beauty, and it's told from the perspective of a horse. And it goes into a lot of stuff about like compassion and treatment for animals. And yeah, it's very interesting the way in which, there's like the non-human is given a voice because it's not an animal voice. We recognize that it's supposed to be an animal, but it's a human voice because it's a human narrative.
Exactly. Thank you so much for the response. There is a question in the chat box. Ananya Datta is saying, do you have anything to say on Emily Dickinson's poem I Killed a Fly in My Room and the book, namely Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka?
I have not heard of Emily Dickin's poem, but now I have to. I'm gonna put that down really quickly before I forget about that.
I think
I
Ananya's
have.
question here becomes very interesting. Like if I can speak about it, I think that I killed a fly in my room is more humanistic in his approach to decenter human relationship, decenter human relations and emotions, and then talk about how that can be channelized through a non-human. The here it becomes the fly. And I think metamorphosis can be seen as something that Liana was talking about earlier, that it's specifically not post-humanism, it's just animal seeing at it as a protagonist, seeing at it as a main character. So I think this is where the contrast, the question that Ritom asked, and the contrast that Liana also talked about comes into play. It's a very beautiful question, because I think the here in these two works, you will see the distinction that Liana was talking about earlier.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah.
the Subarno Rekha is calling that in the adaptation of Black Beauty, the horse is given a voice. Yeah, so yeah, I think that is what happens specifically. That is the entire anthropomorphic movement has been about that, showing animal agency by giving it the human voice. But then I think another question comes into existence, that is linguistics or is language the only medium through which agency can be given? So I think there was this movie, I forgot the name, where the I think there was this alien figure who talks to their daughter, and the language is not a medium. So how, so this here the very interesting question is that, like, is language the only medium through which agency can be given to the non-human? And if not, then what can be the other medium here?
Yeah, because when I think about the metamorphosis, the way I've approached the text in like past courses as well that I've taught on is how the abrupt transformation that the main character goes through. It's like we don't get the sense of terror from that. If I'm looking at, for example, like comparing that to the Fly from Cronenberg's movie, um, we get the entire perspective from the main character as he's already transformed and having to navigate through human, like his human connections, right, and how it falls apart because now he's essentially become a monster, and um, his physical body is a bug. It's a large bug, but it's a bug. But he still maintains his human subjectivity. He just cannot express it anymore because of his physical difference. And then there's so many different ways that that's challenged. Like in The Fly, Seth's transformation is slow. He loses physical aspects of himself until the very last thing he loses is his eyes. And that's when you're supposed to know, like, okay, now the human is gone. So it's really interesting in terms of like distinctly defining the separation between human and animal, and how that is applied in different texts, like in the Metamorphosis, how does that work? In The Fly, how does that work? And you know looking at children's literature like this, um, you get a sense in which, like the author is using human perspectives and human voices to teach compassion, because it's an important aspect, right, of children's education back then. And a lot of the work these authors were doing was trying to make sure that the well-being of the animal was maintained, even if it was the smallest or insignificant, little uh, creature, creatures that I didn't bring it up. Oh my God, I'm gonna bring it up now, even if it's not relevant. But I think it was in Clark's book, he brings up a moment where a sentimentalist got up in front of a court of people that were talking about killing flies, because remember how I mentioned that they were seen as pests, right? They carry diseases, all that stuff. she got up in the court. It was an old lady, and she said that I think that is a terrible idea. I think that flies are important. And she was ridiculed as an old lady in that testament, like the testimony, the written account. So it's like really crazy to think about that as well, and how sentimentalists were ridiculed for, thinking about how we should be compassionate towards small creatures as well. Yeah.
So I think that gives a very clear idea about sentimentalism. That has been a very pivotal aspect of your lecture. And I think that you covered all the aspects of the lecture that you wanted to talk about very well. And it was such an insightful talk. And we are very grateful to have you with us, Liana. Such a same. I think Ritom and I, we have been talking about the same thing. Then it was such a lucid lecture, and specifically when you are talking about thing like bug literature, and specifically any kind of new literature, be it wind literature or green literature, these are the things which are seen to be very critical and very complicated. So it I think that talking so lucidly and so simply about such a vast and very niche area is something that entices people more to work on it, and thereby broadens the way for new future collaboration. So kudos to you for doing that. So yeah, thank you so much. We were very honored to have you with us. And thank you everyone for joining today's lecture with your amazing questions. And yeah, I mean, I think we will see you again on next Sunday. And thank you everyone for joining today. And thank you, Liana, for joining us as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I mean, it was a wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it. It covers everything, like Shaoli mentioned. It is very lucid, and I'm sure like lecture will be there on YouTube as an archive. So anyone who will be working on insect literature or insect studies or anything like that, this video will gonna help them for sure. So I'm really thankful that you are here today for this lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So with this, we'll take you leave. See you guys next Sunday.